The chains on the chair were empty when Arabella Figg walked into courtroom 10, and that was the first thing she noticed, because she was an old woman who noticed the wrong detail first and had made her peace with that years ago. The chair sat at the center of the chamber, iron and old, bolted into the stone floor, with its chains coiled at the base like something sleeping. The room rose around it in tiers, stone benches packed with plum and silver, 50-odd members of the Wisengamot arranged in the shapes of consequence, torches burned in wall brackets, the light flat and authoritative. The air tasted of old ministry stone and parchment and the particular staleness of a room where people had been deciding things about other people for a very long time. Arabella took her seat in the witness alcove and folded her hands in her lap and watched Harry Potter come in. She had watched him for 10 years. She had known the particular way he carried himself along Privet Drive, head angled slightly down, shoulders folded inward, a boy who had learned early and without instruction to take up as little space as possible. In this room, in ministry lighting, in clothing 2 sizes too large that hung off his thin frame, Dudley Dursley's cast-offs, she recognized the cut of them from years of watching. He looked younger than 15. He sat down in the chair. The chains did not bind him, but they were there, and the message of them was clear enough. He looked up once at the benches, then straight ahead, and his expression was the one she had seen on him dozens of times through her sitting-room window, controlled and careful, and waiting for something to go wrong. She had made his visits boring deliberately, the cat photographs, the stale biscuits, the long afternoons, because the Dursleys would have stopped them otherwise, and she needed him to keep coming so she could keep counting him alive. She had reported her observations to Dumbledore, and she had said nothing to anyone else, because those were her instructions, and because she had told herself that being watched in silence was a form of protection. Cornelius Fudge read the charges in a voice designed to foreclose on the outcome before the proceedings began. The decree for the reasonable restriction of underage sorcery, a patroness charm. Cast outside school in the presence of a Muggle on the 2nd of August, 1995. The Muggle, Fudge said, with a deliberateness that seemed aimed at the boy in the chair, was named Dudley Dursley. She had watched Dudley Dursley make Harry's childhood considerably worse over the course of a decade, and she had not said a single word about that either to anyone at all. Albus Dumbledore arrived with 7 minutes already gone, which she suspected was not an accident. He moved through the chamber with the particular unhurriedness of a very old man who had decided at some point that he would not perform urgency on anyone else's schedule. He produced a document. He spoke the relevant words about the Wisengamot Charter of Rights. The room shifted, Fudge's face contracting, Amelia Bones tilting her head with the expression of someone rapidly revising their expectations, the members on the benches stirring like a field when the wind changes direction. Then Dumbledore looked at Arabella quietly and precisely, and she stood and she walked to the witness stand. She had prepared for this. She would describe what she had experienced in the alley near Magnolia Crescent on the evening of the 2nd of August. She would not describe what she had seen, because Squibs could not see Dementors. She knew this, and she knew that the people on Fudge's side of the room were waiting for her to forget it. So she would describe what she had felt. The cold that had nothing to do with temperature, the silence that was not simply the absence of sound, but the absence of everything that sound usually meant, the sensation of every good thing in the world pulling back from her like a tide going wrong. She had stood 30 yards from the mouth of that alley, and she had known immediately what was happening, and she had run toward it anyway, and that was what she would say. She said it. Fudge interrupted twice, each time deploying the word squib with the precision of a man who considered it conclusive. Amelia Bones let him finish both times, and then she asked Arabella to continue. Bones had a square jaw, a monocle, and short grey hair, and the expression of someone who had spent 30 years watching people attempt to lie under oath and had developed highly specific opinions about whether they were succeeding. She asked about the cold, about the silence, about how Arabella had recognized what she could not see. Arabella answered each question in the same unhurried, uninflected voice. Yes, there had been cold. She had spent the whole of her adult life adjacent to the wizarding world, and she knew what dementors left in the air behind them, and there was no other explanation for what she had felt that evening. "Satisfactory," Bones said, in a tone that meant considerably more than satisfactory. Arabella was supposed to step down. She stood at the witness stand and she looked at Harry Potter, and she thought about the word Dumbledore had always sent back to her when she filed a report describing what she had observed in that household. Necessary. The arrangement was necessary. The silence was necessary. The coldness she had watched that household exercise on the boy who lived in it was not her mandate. Her mandate was external threats. She had told herself that for 10 years. Her voice, when she spoke, was quieter than it had been before. "I have something further to tell the court." The chamber did not move. 50 members of the Wizengamot sat with a collective stillness that was not calm. "I have lived near the Dursley household in Little Whinging, Surrey, for approximately 10 years. She paused for the space of one breath and did not look at Dumbledore. She looked at the boy. "By Cop! I was placed there under instructions from Albus Dumbledore. I was to keep an eye on him and say nothing because he was too young. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight." Percy Weasley's quill scratched across his parchment at the table to the left, because that was what his hand had been doing for the duration of this hearing, and it had not yet understood that it might stop. The sound of it was very clear. Amelia Bones turned her head toward the witness stand with the deliberateness of someone who is making very certain she is about to say exactly the right thing. "Mrs. Figg," her voice was careful, the way a surgeon's hands are careful, precise, without wasted motion. "You are saying that Albus Dumbledore placed you in the vicinity of the Dursley household and instructed you to observe and to report to no one." "Yes, Madam Bones." In the chair at the center of the chamber, Harry Potter had not moved. He was looking at Arabella with an expression she had seen on his face before. She had seen it through her sitting-room window more times than she could count, when something happened that was too large, and he had no framework yet for making it smaller. He was 15 years old, and he was sitting in chains in a courtroom, and the woman who had made him look at photographs of cats for a decade had just said something that the whole room had heard and nobody had yet answered. He knew her. That was the thing she could see in his face, and it was not a comfortable thing to watch. He knew the smell of her house and the quality of her biscuits, and the particular studied inattention she had performed whenever he glanced toward her window. He had thought she was nobody. He was discovering in real time, in front of the full Wizengamot and the lime-green bowler hat of the Minister for Magic sitting untouched on the table, that nobody had been watching him his whole life, and had chosen, until this moment, not to say so. Dolores Umbridge had gone very still to Fudge's right, with the specific quality of stillness that belongs to a person who has private reasons for wanting a proceeding to conclude. At the head of the chamber, Albus Dumbledore had not moved. Arabella Figg stood at the witness stand, and she did not look at him. She had made her choice the moment she opened her mouth the second time, and she was finished managing it. The room was still suspended in the moment between what had been said and what would be said next, the moment before the questions began, the moment before everything that came after, and she was standing in it, and her hands were steady, and the boy was looking at her, and she let him look. Amelia Bones let the silence last exactly as long as it needed to, and not a moment longer. Then she opened the folder in front of her, turned to a fresh page, and picked up her quill. "Mrs. Figg," she said, "when did this arrangement begin?" Harry watched from the chair at the center of the chamber. The chains were still loose around his ankles. They had never tightened, which he supposed counted as a good sign, though the morning had produced enough surprises that he had stopped assigning value to signs. Arabella Figg was standing at the witness stand with her hands folded and her back straight, and she looked like a woman who had decided something and was going to stay decided. She had been watching him since he was approximately 5 years old. Placed next door to Privet Drive by Albus Dumbledore for the purpose of keeping an eye on him. And he was 15 years old and hearing this for the first time in a ministry courtroom in front of 50 people, and his brain kept returning to the cat photographs. He kept seeing them, the laminated pages, the aging tabbies, and beginning to understand what they had actually been. Bones questioned Figg the way Harry imagined an architect might examine a building suspected of structural failure, systematically from the foundation up. When did the arrangement begin? What were her specific instructions? What did she observe about Harry's living conditions? What did she report to Dumbledore? Did she at any point seek guidance from any authority other than Dumbledore himself? Figg answered everything. The arrangement had begun approximately 10 years ago. Her instructions were to observe Harry, watch for any approach by agents of Voldemort's former organization, and report to Dumbledore. She described the household as... She had not filed a report with any ministry department. Her mandate, she said, had never been child welfare. It had been threat detection. She never saw anything that would have required mandatory reporting to any wizarding authority, Bones said, making a note, and the flatness of her voice made it clear she was not satisfied with this answer, only recording it. Fudge interrupted at the question about the living conditions. He said the hearing had been convened to address the matter of an underage magic violation, not to conduct a census of Muggle domestic arrangements, and that expanding the scope of testimony beyond the relevant facts would delay proceedings unnecessarily. Bones told him she would determine what was relevant. Fudge said something else. Bones did not respond to it. The exchange had the quality of a pattern that had repeated itself before. Harry watched Fudge. Instead of the witness stand for a moment, the lime-green bowler hat was still on the table in front of the minister, sitting where he had set it down sometime in the last few minutes. Fudge had not put it back on. He was sitting very straight, listening to Figg's testimony with the focused attention of a man performing a rapid calculation, working out what this was worth to him. Whether testimony against Dumbledore was an asset or a liability, and which way the calculation ran. To Fudge's right, Dolores Umbridge sat with her hands folded in her lap and watched Arabella Figg with an expression of total careful stillness. She was a short, squat woman in a pink cardigan, and she had not moved in some time. Not during the prepared testimony. Not during the expanded testimony. Not during Fudge's interruptions. She was utterly still in the way of a person who has decided that the safest thing she can do is look like someone with nothing in particular to think about. Harry had no idea why. When Bones finished her questions to Figg and turned toward Dumbledore, the whole chamber seemed to hold something in reserve. Dumbledore was standing where he had been standing since he arrived, to the left of the defendant's chair, slightly apart from everyone else, his hands loose at his sides. He had not moved either, Harry realized. Not during Figg's expanded testimony. Not during the silence. He had stood there with exactly the expression Harry had seen on him in every difficult situation. That particular stillness Harry had always read as wisdom, and was now reading for the first time as something he didn't have a word for yet. "Headmaster Dumbledore," Bones said, "do you wish to respond to the additional testimony of your witness?" Dumbledore looked at her. He looked at the room. "Nay, he said calmly that Harry Potter's criminal hearing was not the appropriate forum for his account of the arrangement Mrs. Figg had described. The hearing had been convened to address the specific question of underage magic performed under circumstances of genuine danger. That question, he said, had been answered. He would make himself available to answer any question that Madame Bones or the Wizengamot saw fit to put to him in a proper proceeding. Fudge began to say something. Harry looked at the ceiling of the courtroom for a moment. The stone was the kind of grey that had not been a different colour within living memory. The vote was 50 members of the Wizengamot, and a small eternity. And then Cornelius Fudge reading the verdict in a voice so carefully controlled that the control was the tell cleared of all charges. The assembled members would note that the hearing had produced additional testimony that the Department of Magical Law Enforcement would be reviewing in due course, and the defendant was cleared. Fudge said the last word like a man setting down something heavier than expected. Harry stood up. The chains didn't move. He looked down at them once, and then he looked away, and he took a step, and his legs were approximately what he had expected, which was unsteady in the specific way of legs that had been sitting very still in a stone chamber. He walked toward the door, and Arthur Weasley was there. Arthur was standing just inside the courtroom entrance, which Harry had not known, had not thought to check, had been watching the witnesses and the chamber and the ceiling, and had not once looked toward the door. He was tall and angular in his muggle clothes, and his face was white with the particular whiteness of someone who had been standing in that doorway for the entire hearing and heard every word. His mouth was set in a line that was not anger and not grief. He didn't say anything when Harry reached him. He just put one hand briefly on Harry's shoulder, and then he moved to let Harry through. Percy Weasley was at his table in the corner of the chamber, rolling his parchment into a tight scroll. He did not look up when Harry passed. He did not look at Arthur. He concentrated on his parchment with the focused intensity of a man who is making the decision to concentrate on his parchment, and Harry passed him and went through the door and into the ministry corridor. The corridor was cooler than the courtroom and smelled of stone and carpet, and the faint, persistent smell of the ministry itself, which Harry had decided was old parchment and something floral gone wrong. He stood in it for a moment, and then Arthur came through the door behind him, and then Amelia Bones came through the door. She was carrying her folder. She stopped in the corridor, and she looked at Arthur. "Mr. Weasley," she said, "the Department of Magical Law Enforcement will be in contact with you regarding a formal follow-up inquiry. Please expect a written communication within the week." Arthur said he would. Then she looked at Harry. It was the kind of look that notices things. Not an unkind look. Harry did not think Amelia Bones was capable of an unkind look, particularly, but not a comfortable one either. She looked at him with the expression of someone who was observing facts and had already begun filing them. He thought about the clothing he was wearing, Dudley's old things which he had put on that morning in the dim early light of the bedroom at Grimmauld Place without really thinking about it. He thought about what the courtroom had looked like from her side of the table. The boy in the chair, the chains. She said, "You should go home, Mr. Potter." Then she walked back down the corridor and through a door marked Department of Magical Law Enforcement, and it closed behind her. Harry stood in the ministry corridor with Arthur Weasley at his shoulder. Home, he thought. He thought about the word for a moment, where it pointed. The street, the house, the particular smell of number 4, Privet Drive, which he knew the way he knew his own name, the carpet, the closed doors, the way the house held its silence. He thought about Arabella Figg's house across the road, the curtains in the window. He had thought he knew what that street was. He had just heard what it actually was. Home. He thought again. And then he followed Arthur to the lifts. The house at Grimmauld Place received him the way it always did, with indifference and darkness, and the particular smell of old wood, and something underneath the old wood that Harry could never quite name. He stepped through the front door, and the latch clicked shut behind him, and the sounds of the street cut off, and he stood in the entrance hall, in the low gas lamp light, while the house settled back around him. He was grateful for that. He had enough to carry in from outside without whatever the hall portraits added to it. He stood there for a moment, long enough that his heartbeat slowed from the rhythmless pace it had maintained since the ministry corridors, and he thought she was watching from the house across the road. He thought she had been there for 10 years. He thought I sat in her sitting room and looked at photographs of cats and thought she was just an old woman who had nothing better to do. Then he heard footsteps on the stairs, and he made himself move. Ron and Hermione were coming down toward him. Ron was still wearing the expression he'd had since Arthur came home. Not quite fear, not quite dread, something between them that had taken root in his face when his father had walked through the door an hour ago, looking like a man who had just seen the shape of something very large in the dark. Hermione had her arms crossed and her jaw set, which was Hermione's expression. For I have been waiting with questions, and I have been very patient, and I am nearly done being patient. The sight of Harry, apparently, was enough to drain it. She looked at him, and the questions went out of her face and something else came in. "Tell us," Ron said from the 4th step. Harry sat down on the stairs because there was no particular reason to stand up, and they sat down too, Ron 2 steps above him, Hermione beside. Ron and Harry told them. He told it in the order it had happened, because that seemed like the only way to make it stay in the right shape, the courtroom. The charge. Dumbledore arriving late and invoking the Charter of Rights. Figg on the witness stand, describing the alley near Magnolia Crescent, the cold and the silence and the sensation of everything good in the world pulling away from her. Fudge interrupting. Bones questioning. The acquittal. He paused there, and then he said the rest. She had stayed at the stand. She had said she had something further to tell the court. She had said she had been placed near the Dursley household, under instructions from Albus Dumbledore, for approximately 10 years. She had been told to keep an eye on him and say nothing because he was too young. Ron was very still by the time Harry finished. Hermione had her hand pressed flat against the step she was sitting on, as though the staircase might be less trustworthy than usual. "She said that," Hermione said, "under oath, in front of the full Wizengamot. Yes, Percy wrote it down. I saw him." Harry thought of Percy's quill, still moving across the parchment while the room went quiet around it. He didn't stop writing. Hermione looked at the wall beside her with the expression she had when she was doing calculations that she did not like the result of. Ron looked at Harry. He had the particular look he sometimes had, the one that meant he was trying to find the right thing to say, and suspected there wasn't one, and would settle for being here instead. Neither of them had said anything else yet when the sound of a door came from the corridor at the bottom of the stairs. Sirius had been in the doorway long enough to have heard some of it. Harry could tell from how still he was standing That quality of stillness that had nothing to do with calm, that was the opposite of calm, that was a person holding something in their own hands very tightly. He was lean and dark-haired, with the kind of face that had been handsome before Azkaban and still carried the shape of it. And he was looking at Harry with an expression Harry had never seen him wear before, something that had gone very far past anger to the other side of it, where things were cold. "Come down here," Sirius said. "Not a question. Not quite a request." They came down. The kitchen was warmer than the hallway, lit properly with the remains of supper still on the table and a jug of pumpkin juice that no one had put away. They sat, and Sirius remained standing, and he looked at Harry. "Tell me what she said." Exactly. Harry told him exactly. He said the words he had already said once on the stairs, and they did not get easier the second time, and Sirius listened to all of them without interrupting. When Harry finished, Sirius was quiet. He walked to the fireplace. It was unlit, it was August, and he stood with his back to the room for a moment. Harry had the sense that Sirius was doing something specific and deliberate, some internal exercise in containment, and that it was working imperfectly. "He knew," Sirius said. "To the fireplace, to the wall. He put you there knowing." It was not a question. Harry didn't answer it. He sat with the truth of it in his chest, which was where it had been sitting since the ministry, and he felt it settle slightly differently now that someone else had said it aloud, like it had shifted into a place where it was permanent instead of provisional, like it was real now, in a different way than it had been 2 minutes ago. Sirius turned around. His expression had resolved into something quieter than what it had been, which was worse, in Harry's opinion, than the contained fury, because the quiet version looked like it had somewhere to go and had already worked out where. "You're my godfather's son," Sirius said, to no one in particular. Then to Harry, "I had a legal claim. Before you were 2 years old, I had a legal claim to raise you, and Dumbledore—" He stopped. He looked at the table. "I should have pressed it when I got out. I should have pressed it instead of letting him tell me what was necessary." "You were trying to prove you weren't a murderer," Harry said. That was a fairly full schedule. Sirius looked at him. Something moved in his face, not quite a smile, not quite grief. Some expression that held both in different proportions. He sat down at the table. The twins appeared in the kitchen doorway. Fred and George Weasley were 17, and they had arrived in the doorway the way they arrived most places, as a pair, simultaneously, as though they had agreed on the timing without needing to discuss it. They looked at the room. They looked at Sirius at the table and Harry across from him and Ron and Hermione on the bench. They looked at each other. They came in and sat on the floor, backs against the dresser, and said nothing. It was remarkable, and Harry noticed it the way you notice something remarkable, and then he did not say anything about it either. The owl came an hour later, while the kitchen had settled into a quieter kind of occupied Ron and Hermione at the table now. Sirius with his hands wrapped around a mug he was not drinking from. Fred and George having moved to chairs at some point without anyone marking the transition. The owl arrived at the window with a self-important air of ministry post, and Harry got up and took the letter. It was short. It was in Dumbledore's handwriting, which Harry had seen on many notes, and felt, until today, a specific quality of reassurance when he recognized. He would like to speak with Harry, it said. He was available whenever Harry wished. Harry read it twice. He folded it and put it in his pocket. He sat back down. Ron watched him and did not ask. Hermione watched him and did not ask. Sirius watched him, and something in his expression said he understood. And Harry thought, yes, that's right, that's what I'm doing. And it was strange to feel understood about a thing he had not done before in his life. Later, much later, after the twins had gone to bed and Ron had fallen asleep at the table and Sirius had disappeared somewhere in the house with the restless quiet of a man who had too much room in his head and not enough in his body, and she went upstairs. He sat at the kitchen table in the house that smelled of old magic and other people's histories, and he did not go to Dumbledore. He was still sitting there when Ginny came down. She was in pajamas, red hair loose. She went to the cupboard and got a glass and filled it at the tap and set it in front of him and sat down across the table. He looked at the glass. He picked it up and drank. She was 14 years old, had been 14 for exactly 2 days, and she sat there with her hands on the table, and she said nothing, and he said nothing, and outside the window of the kitchen the London night went on without them, and the glass of water was cold and ordinary, and he was very glad she had brought it. Dumbledore did not send another owl. He arrived the following morning at the front door of 12 Grimmauld Place. This was notable in itself. He was the secret keeper. He could have demanded Harry come to Hogwarts, or summoned him through any number of channels that would have put Harry on the back foot before they had even begun. He had not. He had come to the house in the morning and stood at the door like a person asking permission to enter. Harry heard the knock. He had been at the kitchen table since before anyone else was awake, not sleeping, not really doing anything else either, just sitting with a cup of tea that had gone cold while the early light came down through the narrow window near the ceiling. He heard the knock and he heard Sirius's voice upstairs, and then footsteps, and then silence, and then Ron appeared in the kitchen doorway looking like a man with a message he had been handed against his will. "He's here." "I know," Harry said. "Do you want—" "I'll go." He went up to the hallway. Sirius was standing at the far end of it with his arms crossed and an expression that was very controlled. Dumbledore was at the door, inside but only just, as though he had not presumed to come any further. He was silver-haired and silver-bearded and dressed in robes, the dark blue of deep water, and he looked at Harry over his half-moon spectacles with those blue eyes that had always, until yesterday, seemed to Harry like a form of reassurance. He did not look reassured now himself. That was new. "I thought," Harry said, "we could use the kitchen as you like," Dumbledore said. They went down the stairs and Sirius did not follow, which Harry appreciated. He sat at the long scrubbed table. The same chair he had been sitting in all morning, the same one he had been sitting in when Ginny brought him water the night before, which, for reasons he had not examined, made it feel like his chair in this room. And Dumbledore sat across from him and set his hands on the table and waited. Harry had thought about what he wanted to say. He had been thinking about it since before dawn. "Tell me the truth," he said. "The whole thing you placed Figg there?" "Why?" Dumbledore told him. His voice was level and unhurried in the way it always was, and what he said was this. After the First Wizarding War ended, and after Harry was left with his aunt and uncle, Dumbledore had arranged for Arabella Figg to take a house nearby. Her purpose was surveillance. The threat Dumbledore had feared was not the Dursleys, it was Voldemort's remaining agents, the followers who had not been captured, who might attempt to reach Harry in the years before he came of age. Figg was a squib and a capable observer and willing to take on the work. Her instructions had been to watch for any sign of magical approach. That was the mandate, Harry said. Yes, nothing about what was happening inside the house. Dumbledore looked at him steadily. Her primary purpose was external threat detection. That isn't quite what I asked, Harry said. He was surprised by how calm he sounded. Inside his chest, there was something with edges, something he had been carrying since the ministry. But out here, It was not yet showing. Did you know what it was like in there before yesterday? Did you know? The pause before Dumbledore's answer was brief. It was the pause of a man choosing which truth to tell. I knew the Dursleys were not warm, Dumbledore said. I knew the household would not be kind in the conventional sense. I believed they would provide what was necessary. Food, shelter, physical safety. They did, Harry said. Mostly Harry. Fig saw it. She told you, didn't she? It was not a question. He watched Dumbledore's face confirm it before the answer came. She sent reports. She told you the household was cold, that I was, what did she say, unhappy. She reported that your environment was not a nurturing one, Dumbledore said carefully, that you appeared, yes, unhappy, and you made a calculation. I did. Harry looked at the table. The grain of the wood ran in long, uneven lines that had probably always been there and that he had not previously paid any attention to. He thought about what a calculation like that would look like. A man sitting somewhere, at some desk, with a report in front of him. The household was cold, the boy seemed unhappy, and deciding that what he had was sufficient, and filing it and moving on. The blood protection, he said. You're going to tell me about the blood protection. It is real, Dumbledore said. It is not an excuse. Your mother's sacrifice anchored a very old and very powerful magic to the one blood relative who chose to shelter you. While you call Petunia's home your home, the protection holds. It would not hold in the same way anywhere else. I know, Harry said. You explained it yesterday in this room. No, last night in the ministry corridor. No, that was Bones. He was losing track of all the places he had been told things in the last 24 hours. You've explained it since. I understand the blood protection. What I'm asking about is the calculation. Whether the blood protection required everything else. Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. The arrangement was designed to protect you, he said. I'm not asking about the arrangement, Harry said. She was told not to speak. She was told to say nothing to me, to say nothing to anyone, for 10 years. You told her I was too young to know. Did the blood protection require her to say nothing? Does Lily's magic require that no one speak? Something moved in Dumbledore's face. A shift, a response to something he had not been expecting to be asked so precisely. Harry watched it and thought, he knows the answer to this. He knows what the answer is, and he has already worked out what it costs him. No, Dumbledore said. The blood protection required you to live with Petunia. It did not require silence. Coke. The word landed in the kitchen the way a stone lands in still water. Harry sat with it. Then why, he said. He meant it very simply. He meant, why the whole edifice of it? Why the closed-off life? And the instructions and the years of careful nothing? He asked. And Dumbledore looked at him, and Harry could see him weighing something, could almost see the shape of the thing being weighed, a weight Dumbledore had been carrying for longer than Harry had been alive. There are reasons, Dumbledore said, that I cannot fully share with you yet. There is a burden you carry, Harry, a reason your protection has mattered so profoundly that I believe you are not yet ready to hear in full. You told her I was too young to know, Harry said. Is that what you're telling me now? Dumbledore did not look away. I am telling you that there are things I am not yet able to say. Are you able to say whether they're true? They are true. And you're keeping them from me because you've decided I can't bear them. Because I believe that the time must be right, Dumbledore said, and his voice was as steady as it always was, and Harry thought, that is what it sounds like, when someone who loves you manages you. That steadiness, that certainty. That particular quality of knowing what is best and proceeding on that knowledge, regardless of what anyone has asked. You told her I was too young to know, Harry said again. He was not raising his voice, there was no need to. That was the mandate. I was too young to know. And now you're saying the same thing. I'm too young to know. I'm not ready. He stopped. He looked at his own hands on the table. I was too young to know, he said. But I wasn't too young to live it. Dumbledore had no answer for that. He sat for a moment longer, and then he rose from the table with the careful unhurriedness of a very old man, and he said that he was grateful Harry had agreed to speak with him, and that he would be available if Harry had more questions at any time, and that he was sorry. And this last he said plainly, without elaboration. One in the voice of a man who knows that sorry is not sufficient, and says it anyway, because there is nothing else available. He left the kitchen. Harry listened to his footsteps go through the hall and up toward the front door. He heard the door open. He heard it close, quietly, not slammed, just closed, with the careful, ordinary sound of a door doing what doors do. Harry sat at the kitchen table and looked at the place where Dumbledore had been sitting, and the cold cup of tea he had abandoned 2 hours ago was still there, and the morning light was coming through the window, and the house around him was beginning to stir with the sounds of other people waking. And he sat there for a long time, in the quiet of a room that had just held a conversation he had not lost, and had not won, and would be carrying for a very long time. The letter came on the 17th of August, which was a Wednesday. Arabella Figg had been staying at Grimmauld Place since the hearing. She had not planned to stay. She had intended to go home to Little Whinging after the verdict, to her cats and her curtains, and the particular quiet of a house she had lived in alone for 15 years. And that intention had lasted precisely until Molly Weasley had found her sitting in the hallway with her coat still on. Too, in the tone of a woman who does not really ask things so much as establish them, whether Arabella had eaten anything since breakfast. She had not. She had stayed. The house had folded her in after a fashion. She slept in a small room on the 3rd floor that smelled of old fabric and something faintly metallic, and she helped in the kitchen in the mornings, and she tried not to be in any room where conversation stopped when she entered. This happened sometimes, not hostilely, but with the particular awkwardness of people who are not yet sure what to do with the woman who had said the thing that changed everything. She understood. She was not yet sure what to do with herself. Either she was in the kitchen, drinking tea, when the owl arrived. It was ministry post, the kind that arrived with the self-conscious significance of official stationery. The letter was addressed to her in full. Mrs. Arabella Doreen Figg. The formality of it sat in her hands with weight. She set it on the table and read it. Amelia Bones, head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, requested the attendance of Mrs. Arabella Figg at a formal DMLE inquiry into the circumstances and content of her testimony at the Wizengamot hearing of the 12th of August 1995. She was to present herself at the ministry on the 22nd. A copy of this communication had been forwarded to Albus Dumbledore, headmaster of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. Arabella read it twice. Then she folded it and held it and looked out the narrow kitchen window at the London morning. She was not afraid of being wrong. She had held that fear up to the light very carefully over the past several days, and she did not believe. She had been wrong to say what she had said. She had spoken the truth. The truth had been due for a very long time. No, what she felt reading this letter was something different from the fear of having erred. What she felt was the particular cold of rightness, the moment when the right thing turns out to have consequences, real ones that must be lived through rather than contemplated. She drank the rest of her tea and told herself She had always known this part was coming. On the 22nd, she presented herself at the ministry, went through security, and was directed to Amelia Bones's office on the level that housed the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. The office was what she had expected, neat in the way that suggested neatness as a discipline rather than a temperament, with folders stacked and labeled and a surface cleared for work. Bones was there when Arabella arrived, and she looked up and she gestured to the chair across the desk. "Thank you for coming, Mrs. Figg," she said, which was the last thing that functioned as a social pleasantry. After that, she opened a folder, picked up her pen, and began. "When did the arrangement begin?" Arabella told her. "How did Dumbledore contact her? Letter, direct visit, intermediary, letter, and then a meeting. What were her precise instructions? To watch Harry Potter at number 4 Privet Drive for any sign of approach by agents of Voldemort or those who remained loyal to his work. To report these observations to Dumbledore directly. To maintain a presence in the neighborhood that would allow continued access. To take no action that would reveal the existence of the surveillance. And did your instructions include anything about the child's welfare?" Bones asked. "His living conditions, how he was being treated." "No," Arabella said. "My mandate was external threats." Bones made a note. "And yet you did observe his living conditions over 10 years. "Yes. Describe what you observed." She described it in the same plain voice she had used at the hearing. The household's particular coldness, the way it operated, the way the boy had moved through it. She described the arrangement she had made, the deliberately dull visits, the cat photographs, the biscuits that weren't quite fresh. She said she had done this to preserve her access, because if Harry had appeared to enjoy the visits, the Dursleys would have stopped them, and she had needed him to keep coming so she could keep counting him present. She said it as a fact, because it was a fact, and she did not offer the word sorry because it did not seem like the right moment for it, and also because she was not certain it was the right word. "So you arranged for the child to find your company unpleasant," Bones said without inflection, "in order to maintain the surveillance." "Yes. And your reports to Dumbledore, what did those contain?" "I reported the number and nature of any anomalous observations. I reported his general condition. I said the household was not a warm one. I said the boy seemed unhappy. And Dumbledore's response to those reports." She had thought about how to answer this in the days between the letter and this room. She had thought about it while she helped with the dishes at Grimmauld Place, and while she lay awake in the small third-floor room, and while she sat with her tea this morning. The answer was, he had thanked her and reiterated that the arrangement was necessary, and that she should continue as she was. The answer was, he had heard and had made a calculation and had told her to proceed. She said this. Bones wrote it down. There was a silence of the working kind, the kind that is not pause but processing. And then Bones looked up from her notes and said, "In 10 years of observation, Mrs. Bates, Figg, did you ever witness Harry Potter's treatment in that household and conclude that another adult in the wizarding world should be informed? Someone other than Albus Dumbledore?" The room was very quiet. Arabella thought about what a precise question that was. She thought about all the moments it contained, years of them stacked, the specific moments when she had stood at her window and seen the boy come out of that house with an expression she recognized and thought, someone ought to know. She thought about the specific shape of what ought meant, how it sat differently from must, how it had always been possible to acknowledge an ought and then decide, for reasons always, for reasons, that it did not apply right now in this case to this mandate. "No," she said. Bones wrote it down without comment. Then she said, Was there ever a moment when you believed your obligation to the child might outweigh your obligation to your orders? The question was asked in the same level, unhurried voice as all the others, and it sat in the air between them with more weight than the others had carried. She had done the right thing, Arabella had. She had told the truth under oath, in front of the Wizengamot, at cost to herself, and at cost to a man she had followed for 20 years. She had stood at that witness stand and said the words she had been carrying for 10 years and not saying. She knew what that was worth, and she held it, and it was worth something real. It was not the same as a clean answer to this question. I told the truth under oath, she said. That was the first time I had the authority to do it. Before that, I had my orders, and I had my mandate, and I had the word necessary, and I believed them. She paused. I believed him. Bones looked at her for a moment, not unkindly, not warmly either, with the expression of a woman who has heard a great many people explain the space between knowing something and acting on it, and has formed views about that space. She did not offer a verdict on what Arabella had said. She wrote something in her folder. Then she set her pen down with the deliberate care of a woman for whom setting things down deliberately is a habit of mind, the suggestion that nothing in this room was without intention, that even this small motion of ending was chosen. "Thank you, Mrs. Figg," she said. "That will be all for today." Arabella picked up her coat and her bag and walked out of the office and through the Department of Magical Law Enforcement and into the ministry corridors, and she went home. Snape arrived at Grimmauld Place in the early evening of the last week of August, let himself in through the front door with the particular efficiency of a man who finds the location unpleasant and intends to waste as little time in it as possible, and went down to the kitchen. The order meeting had not yet begun. Members were still filing in, arranging themselves around the long table with the unconscious hierarchy of people who have been in rooms like this before, Dumbledore at the head, as always. Arthur Weasley to his left, which was where Arthur always sat. Sirius Black had taken a chair at the far end, which was the seat of a man who was not going to accept the arrangement of this room. Remus Lupin sat beside Sirius, in the way he always sat beside Sirius, close enough to constitute readiness. Snape sat at the edge of the table, which was where he always sat, and he did not speak to anyone, and no one spoke to him, and this was how it usually went, and he was fine with it. He watched Dumbledore settle into the chair at the head of the table. The old man looked well, which Snape noted the way he noted everything, as data. He looked rested and deliberate and entirely like himself, which was both reassuring and, at this particular moment, faintly irritating. He had been censured, not formally yet, but in effect, by the testimony of a squib in the court of Wizarding Britain, and his eyes behind his half-moon spectacles held the same mild, penetrating quality they always held. He had made peace with whatever this was, or the performance of peace was his natural state. Snape had never been entirely certain which. Dumbledore spoke. He reported the situation in the flat, measured tone he used for delivering difficult information to people who would have strong feelings about it. Harry Potter had been acquitted at the Wizengamot hearing on the 12th. This was the intended outcome, and should be considered a success. Arabella Figg's expanded testimony. Here, his voice did not change at all, which was its own form of information, had created a complication. The Department of Magical Law Enforcement, under Madame Bones, was conducting a formal inquiry. He had received a communication from the DMLE and expected to be summoned to speak with Madame Bones in due course. He considered the situation manageable. The room let him finish. Sirius Black did not wait long after that. "Manageable," Sirius said. The word sat in his mouth like something he was tasting for the first time. You placed a child with people who made his life miserable for 15 years. You knew. You had someone watching, which means you had reports, which means you knew. And it's manageable. Sirius, Lupin said very quietly. I'm not shouting, Sirius said. Which was true. His voice was controlled. Even, this was in Snape's view, more alarming than shouting. I'm making a factual statement. He knew, and he continued the arrangement, and he did not tell me at any point in the past 2 years that I could have, that there might have been. He stopped. He pressed his hands flat on the table. I had a legal claim. As Harry's godfather, before he was 2 years old, I had a legal claim to raise him, and no one thought to tell me that. Your situation made that claim impossible to pursue, Dumbledore said. He was not unkind when he said it. He was not defensive. He simply said it as a fact among facts. My situation, Sirius said. Yes, my situation. My situation that went on for 12 years, while no one pursued it. The distinction, Snape thought, looking at his own hands on the table edge, was an interesting one. That Sirius's claim could not be pursued was not the same as saying no one had tried. He did not say this aloud. It was not his argument to make, and also he was not entirely sure where he stood on it. Dumbledore's explanation of the blood protection was thorough and patient, and exactly what Snape had expected. The magic anchored to Petunia Dursley's home. The requirement that Harry call it home, that a blood relative of his mother's line choose to shelter him. The protection was real. It was powerful. It had been, in Dumbledore's assessment, the most reliable shield available for Harry in the years before he could protect himself. Sirius interrupted before Dumbledore had finished. He said the blood protection required Harry to acknowledge Petunia's home. It did not require Sirius to be absent. It did not require that no one else in the wizarding world know the arrangement. It did not require that Harry's godfather be kept ignorant of where the boy was living and under what conditions. Those had been separate decisions. A theoretical argument, Dumbledore said. A legal one, Sirius said. One Madame Bones seems to agree is worth examining. Dumbledore said nothing for a moment. Snape watched him. There was something in the quality of that silence that he had not seen in Dumbledore before. Not uncertainty, exactly, but the shadow that uncertainty casts. The shape of a man who has been in the habit of certainty for so long that the habit has become the man and is now finding, in a room full of people who are looking at him, that the habit may not be sufficient. Arthur Weasley, who had been sitting very quietly to Dumbledore's left, said, in his mild way, I was there, in the corridor, after the acquittal, when Madame Bones stopped us. He paused. I've been thinking about it since. What it means to know that a child has been observed, watched for years by our people, and never once, in all those years, been asked how he was. He said it simply as a statement of thought, rather than accusation. Arthur Weasley's style had always been to say the most devastating things in the voice of someone who was still working out what he believed. Snape found it, on a technical level, effective. The table was quiet. Snape had not intended to speak. He had come to this meeting as he came to most order meetings, to observe and to carry back what Dumbledore needed him to carry, and to add nothing to the sum of emotional noise in the room. He had been largely successful. He was still largely successful. He said growing up without anyone noticing is a very specific kind of damage. He said it to the table or to no one in particular in the voice he used when he was stating a fact that did not require elaboration or attribution. He did not say he knew this. He did not say anything else. He picked up his tea, which had gone cold, and he drank some of it. The room held the remark. Sirius was looking at him across the table. It was not a comfortable look. Their history did not produce comfortable looks, but it was not the look it usually was either. It was the look of a person who has heard something they did not expect from a source they did not expect, and is being honest enough with themselves to register it. Snape looked back at his cup. Dumbledore, at the head of the table, folded his hands. He said that he understood the concerns being raised. He said that he believed then and now that the arrangement had been necessary in ways that he was not yet in a position to fully disclose. And here something moved through the room, a collective recognition of that phrase. He said he was asking the Order to trust his judgment one more time. He said he was grateful for that trust, and was aware that he had not, in this instance, fully earned the extension of it. Then he said he believed they should move on to the other business of the evening. They moved on. The meeting ran its usual course: reports on ministry movements, on known Death Eater activities, on progress in various assignments. And the tension in the room did not leave, but it moved, settled into the background, the way all tensions eventually settle. Molly passed food around. Arthur took notes. Lupin gave a quiet account of something he had been looking into in the north. When it ended, the kitchen emptied in the usual order. Pairs and individuals drifting out, conversations continuing in the hallway, boots on stairs. Snape watched the room clear. He was the last one left. He stood from the table and put on his outer robe and picked up his things. He walked to the kitchen door, and he stopped in the doorway with the edge of the door in his hand. Dumbledore was still at the head of the table, sitting with one hand resting on the surface and the other in his lap, looking at the space where the meeting had been. Snape stood in the doorway for the length of several seconds. He did not look at Dumbledore. He left. He came back on a Tuesday, in the last week of August, in the back of a car driven by a wizard who did not attempt conversation. Harry watched Surrey through the window. He had not been back since the 12th. He had not, between the hearing and now, thought very much about what the street would look like when he saw it again. He thought about it now. He came back because the blood protection required it. He had understood that before. Dumbledore had said so in the ministry corridor, and again in the kitchen at Grimmauld Place. And it had always seemed like a thing said at him rather than a thing he was meant to do anything with. But he had asked Dumbledore to say it plainly. This time, and Dumbledore had said it plainly. The magic was anchored to Petunia's house, and to Harry's acknowledgement of it as home. It would hold until he came of age. Until then, he needed to return to it. Sleep in it. Let the magic do what the magic did. The blood protection required this. It had not required anything else. He understood the distinction now. He came back because he had chosen to, knowing what it was. The car stopped at the corner of Privet Drive. He got out. He got his trunk. The driver did not help with the trunk, or say anything, or wait. Harry heard the engine pull away from the curb before he had even reached the pavement. He stood on the corner and looked at the street. It looked like itself. This was the thing about Privet Drive. It always looked like itself, and had always looked like itself, and appeared to have been designed from the beginning to look exactly like what it was: orderly, trim. The gardens tidy, the front drives clean, the windows uninteresting. It was August, and the light was warm and flat, and the street had no opinion about anything. He picked up his trunk and walked. He had walked this stretch of pavement so many times that he could have done it asleep. He walked it now and thought, the last time I was on this street, I didn't know what I was walking between. Vernon Dursley opened the door before Harry had reached it. He was a large man, Vernon, large in the way of someone who had grown into it slowly and was now settled in it permanently, and he stood in the doorway with his arms crossed and his face set in the expression he wore when he was trying to decide what he was going to do about something. He looked at Harry. He looked at the trunk. He uncrossed his arms. Petunia had told him something. Harry could see it in the way Vernon was standing, the particular stillness of a man who has received information that has changed the size of the thing he thought he was dealing with. He was not performing contempt, which was what he usually did. He was standing with the posture of a man recalculating. "Right," Vernon said. "Not hello, not anything else, just right." Harry carried his trunk through the door and up the stairs. The house was quiet in the way it was always quiet, that particular internal silence of a house that does not have music or noise unless someone has decided to create it, which in this house was never. Dudley was somewhere else. Harry could tell from the absence of him. Petunia was not visible. Harry walked through the hallway and past the kitchen and down the short run of corridor toward the stairs. And he passed the cupboard. He stopped. It was a door. That was all it was. At this point in his life, a door under the stairs with a bolt that had been put there when he was old enough to remember someone putting it there. He had slept behind that bolt for 10 years. Not every night, not after year 1, but before year 1, yes, and for the whole of the summers of year 2 and year 3, he had lain in his proper room and been aware of it, aware that the cupboard was there, aware of its particular size and smell and the way the light came through the gap at the bottom. He looked at the door. He did not open it. There was nothing in it now that he needed to see. He just stood for a moment and looked at it, the way you look at something you have been carrying for a long time and have only just found the name for. Then he went upstairs and left his trunk in his room. Later, when the evening light had gone orange through the window and Dudley still hadn't come home and Vernon had retreated to the sitting room with his newspaper, Harry went down to the kitchen for a glass of water. He had been outside in the late afternoon, standing on the front step, looking at the house across the road. Mrs. Figg's house had the curtains drawn against the sun. He could see the shape of a cat in the window, just a silhouette, curled on the sill. He looked at the house and thought about all the afternoons he had sat in her sitting room, looking at laminated photographs of cats he did not care about, eating biscuits that were not quite fresh. He had always thought she had given him the biscuits because she was kind in a dim sort of way, the way elderly neighbors were kind when they had nothing better to do. She had made them not quite fresh, so he wouldn't look forward to it. She had been managing him, the way you manage something that must continue but cannot be allowed to thrive. All those years of careful dullness, all those photographs, and she had been counting him present, watched, not well, but watched. He stood there until the sun moved, and then he went inside. Petunia was in the kitchen. She was doing something at the counter, something that did not actually need doing. He could tell from the way she was moving that she had been in the kitchen waiting, not cooking. She turned when she heard him come in, and she looked at him with the expression she sometimes wore when she was about to say something she had not said before, which was an expression Harry had learned to recognize, mostly because it was so rare. "Shh," she said. "When you were left here 14 years ago, there was a letter." Harry stood by the door and did not say anything. She was thin Petunia and blonde in the way that required effort to maintain, and she had a long neck and the kind of face that had been set into its expression for so many years that the expression had become the face. She looked at a point near Harry's shoulder rather than at his eyes, which was how she usually spoke to him when she was saying something she had not planned to say. "Dumbledore left a letter," she said. "It explained what you were, what you carried, what we would receive in return if we took you in." She paused. The letter was very clear about what we would receive. "Protection," Harry said. "Protection," she said. She turned back to the counter, briefly, then turned back again. "I made a choice. I did not know. When I made it, what it would cost every day afterward. I did not know I would resent you for it." She said it without apology and without softening. It was a statement of fact delivered in the voice of someone who has decided, at this particular late point, to be accurate. She had resented him every day. For 14 years, she was saying this as a thing that was true, not as a thing she was sorry for, because she was not sorry for having felt what she felt, and Petunia Dursley had never been a woman who apologized for things she actually believed. "I know," Harry said. She looked at him then, not at his shoulder, at him. She searched his face for something. He didn't know what, and whatever she found there seemed to be enough, because she looked away again, and her hand settled on the counter. "Breakfast is at 7, she said. "Same as always." He went back upstairs. His room was the same room it had always been. The same window, the same narrow view of the back garden, and the fence, and the identical back gardens of the houses behind them. He had looked at this ceiling on the first night he came to Hogwarts, and thought, "I am going to a different place." He had looked at it every summer since, and thought, "I am going back." He lay on his back, and looked at it now. 23 days until September 1st. He counted them the way he had counted them every summer since he was 11, not dreading the end, but counting toward the start of something else, marking the distance between this ceiling, the moving staircases, and the smell of the great hall. Then he closed his eyes, and the house settled into its familiar quiet, and he lay in the middle of it and understood clearly for the first time that understanding a place is not the same as having been all right in it. He had not been all right in it. He had been here. That was not the same thing, and now he had the words for it, and 23 days, and then he would go. Amelia Bones finished the record on the 4th of September and read it twice before she signed it. She had written it in longhand, which was her practice for documents of this kind. Documents that would be examined, that would be cited, that would need to hold their meaning precisely under conditions she could not control. The record was 41 pages. It contained a summary of Arabella Figg's expanded courtroom testimony of the 12th of August, 1995, a full transcript of the formal DMLE inquiry of the 22nd of August, a list of specific factual findings and their sources. Dumbledore, headmaster of Hogwarts, School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, be summoned to appear at a DMLE inquiry for the purpose of providing a formal account of the mandate he had established and the instructions he had given. There was no editorial commentary in the record. Bones did not write editorials. Her opinion of the matter could be found in her face at the appropriate moment, not in official documents. She signed the record. She blotted it. She set it in the outgoing file. The summons to Dumbledore she wrote herself and sent by Ministry Owl the same afternoon. She included a summary of Mrs. Bester. Figg's testimony as given, so that he would know precisely what the inquiry had established before he arrived. She was not, in her experience, someone who could be surprised by the range of things people did to children and convince themselves were necessary. But there were cases that sat differently from others. This was one of them. She did not write this in the record. She thought it in the privacy of her office, with the door closed, and then she got on with the next file. The meeting was scheduled for the 17th. It did not reach the 17th before it became something else. On the 9th, Cornelius Fudge called her. He was very cheerful about it, which was the tell. Fudge, in a genuine good mood, was expansive and slightly absent, the way happy people sometimes were. Fudge cheerful about something specific, was a different register entirely. It was the cheerfulness of a man who had worked out a calculation and found the number he wanted, and who was now performing pleasure rather than feeling it. Bones had known him for 15 years and could tell the difference without difficulty. He had heard, he said, that the Figg inquiry had produced some significant findings. He was glad, naturally, to hear it. He had every confidence in the DMLE's thoroughness, and he was of the view that this matter deserved the full weight of institutional scrutiny. That was why, he said, he had been thinking. A DMLE inquiry was one instrument, but given the seriousness of what had emerged, the scope of it, the name attached to it, he wondered whether the matter deserved to be elevated. A formal Wizengamot censure hearing, with the minister co-chairing alongside the DMLE head, would ensure the matter received the gravity it warranted. Bones said she would consider it. She did not consider it, she knew what it was. The inquiry in her hands was a factual process aimed at establishing what had happened and whether it warranted formal consequences. What Fudge was proposing was a different animal, a public proceeding with the minister at the head of it, aimed at the man who had spent months contradicting Fudge's position on Voldemort's return. A formal censure by the Wizengamot, publicly recorded, would damage that authority in a way no counter-argument could fully repair. She did not think Fudge was wrong, that the matter warranted serious consequences. She thought he was right for entirely the wrong reasons. On the 11th, she received formal notice from the minister's office that the matter had been elevated to a Wizengamot censure hearing. The date was set for the 22nd. The notice listed her as co-chair with the minister presiding. She had been in the building for 22 years. She knew when a process had moved beyond her. She had not been present in Fudge's office when the decision was made, but received an account later. Dolores Umbridge had been there. She had agreed with Fudge's proposal immediately, with the speed of someone who had been waiting for it. She had smiled, the kind of smile that occupied a great deal of her face, and said that a prompt conclusion would serve everyone's interests, with the emphasis of someone whose emphasis was doing more work than the words. Bones filed this account where she filed most things she was not yet ready to act on. On the 17th, Albus Dumbledore came to her office. He arrived on time, which she expected. He was dressed in robes of dark purple, with his silver hair and silver beard arranged with the care of someone who understood that appearance communicated authority, and his half-moon spectacles were level on his nose. And he sat in the chair across from her desk, with his hands folded in his lap, and looked at her with those very blue eyes that were currently, she noted, entirely steady. "Thank you for coming, Headmaster," she said. "Thank you for the thorough summary of Mrs. Figg's testimony," he said. "It was, as I expected it to be, accurate." She opened her folder. She picked up her pen. She asked him to confirm the existence of the surveillance mandate he had established at 4 Privet Drive, Little Whinging, Surrey, in or around 1981. He confirmed it. She asked him to describe, in his own words, the instructions he had given Mrs. Figg. He described them. She asked whether Mrs. Figg had been instructed to report to any authority other than himself. She had not. Figg had in fact reported her observations about Harry Potter's living conditions to him. She had. She asked whether those reports had indicated that Harry Potter's household was unwelcoming, and that the boy appeared unhappy. They had indicated this. She asked whether he had, in response to those reports, modified the mandate or expanded Mrs. Figg's instructions to include any form of welfare reporting to any wizarding body. He had not. She wrote down each answer as he gave it. He did not hesitate on any of them. "And it is your position," she said, "that these decisions, to maintain the arrangement unchanged, without expansion of mandate or outside notification were made in good faith and in the interests of Harry Potter's safety. It is my position that I made those decisions. Whether good faith is the right description is something I am no longer certain of." Bones looked at him over the top of her folder. "That is a very precise answer," she said. "I am trying," he said, "to be precise." She wrote it down. She looked at her record. She looked at the man across the desk. She had known Albus Dumbledore by reputation and occasionally in person for 4 decades. She had trusted him herself. More than once, she was not sure, at this moment, what to do with the recognition that trust of that kind was its own kind of problem. She asked her last question. If a Muggle authority, she said, had discovered a child in those conditions under the long-term observation of an appointed adult watcher, filing no welfare report under instructions from a single private individual, what outcome would you expect for the person who gave those instructions? The office was quiet. Outside, the sounds of the department went on, doors and footsteps and the distant percussion of internal post. Dumbledore considered the question. He looked, in that moment, not at Bones but at the middle distance, at the space between them, where the question was still sitting. "I expect," he said, "that I would deserve whatever outcome you have in mind, Madam Bones." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she wrote it down. She thanked him. He rose and inclined his head and left. She opened the appropriate ledger and recorded the date and duration of the meeting. She filed the interview notes. She drafted the formal documentation confirming the Wisingamot censure hearing of the 22nd. Then she took a fresh sheet of parchment and she wrote a letter to Harry Potter, care of the Weasley household, which was the address the file gave for his current residence. She wrote it in plain language. She told him that a Wisingamot censure hearing into the conduct of Albus Dumbledore had been formally scheduled. She told him that as a named individual directly affected by the conduct under examination, he had standing to appear as a witness if he chose. She told him, in plain terms, that he was not obligated to appear, that the hearing would proceed regardless, that whatever the outcome, it would be part of the public record of the Wisingamot, but that he should know the option existed, that his account of his experience, if he chose to give it, would be heard in a formal proceeding. She signed it and sealed it and put it in the outgoing post. Then she went home. The same stone, the same torches, the same quality of underground light that made everything look like it had always been here. Harry had been here 6 weeks ago in the chains. He was in the gallery now, a tiered bench along one side where witnesses waited. No chains, just wood and stone and 50 Wisingamot members in plum-colored robes filling the ranked seats below. He sat in the gallery now and waited for it to begin. Cornelius Fudge settled into the presiding chair with the expression of a man who had been handed something and intended to use it. To his right, a recorder had quill and parchment ready. To his left, Amelia Bones sat with her folder closed. Among the elders, Harry noticed an elderly witch, small, white-haired, her hands folded, who he would later learn was Griselda Marchbanks. When Dumbledore had entered at the August hearing, the elders had waved. She watched Dumbledore's entrance with the expression of someone who had known a person for a very long time and was now watching them very carefully. Fudge called the hearing to order. He named the proceeding and the charge and said the name of Albus Percival Wulfric, Brian Dumbledore, with the full weight of official record. Dumbledore, seated in the respondents' area below, sat with his hands in his lap and his silver head slightly bowed, and did not appear to have any opinion about being here. Bones presented first. She did not editorialize. She read from the record her 41-page document, the factual account, and she stated the findings in the plain language of a woman who has spent her career making language do precise work. There had been a surveillance mandate. The mandate had been external threat detection. About the arrangement, reports had been filed with Dumbledore, indicating the child's household was cold and the child appeared unhappy. No modification to the mandate had been made. No report had been filed with any wizarding welfare authority for 10 years. She read it without inflection because the facts had enough weight already. Then she called Arabella Figg. Figg had dressed, Harry noticed, in what appeared to be her better coat, the grey wool one rather than the shapeless beige she'd worn in August. She walked to the witness position steadily. She had testified in this room once before, and something in her had settled since then, a quality Harry recognized from his own experience, the particular equilibrium of someone who has already said the hardest thing and knows that saying it again is just repetition. She said all of it again. The visits, the cat photographs, the biscuits deliberately not quite fresh, the strategy of making herself as unappealing as possible so the Dursleys would not block Harry's access. Mandate. External threats only. Reports filed with Dumbledore noting a cold household and an unhappy boy. Instructions received. Continue, she said it in the flat voice of someone describing a thing that happened. It was her life she was describing, and she said it without self-pity and without excuse. When she was finished, Fudge thanked her and she sat down. Harry saw her hands, now folded in her lap, were entirely still. Then they called him. His name, in Fudge's voice, in this room, sounded different than it had the last time. Different category of his name. He stood from the gallery bench and went down the steps to the witness position, a chair separate from the respondent's area and separate from the defendant's chair, set slightly to the side, where witnesses faced the chamber rather than being enclosed by it. He sat, he looked at the room. He said that at 4 years old he had been put to sleep in a cupboard under the stairs. He said it as a chronological fact, the first fact that mattered. He slept there until he was 11. The Dursleys had not hit him most of the time. They had made clear, in the ordinary language of years, that he was a burden, not invited, not wanted, managed. His cousins discarded clothes, not enough food. No friends on Privet Drive, because Dudley had established that he was not worth the trouble, and the neighborhood had found it easy to agree. He said the last thing, which was the hardest. He said that he had not known, for the first 11 years of his life, that he had a godfather. He had not known wizarding children had guardians, or that there were people who might have been told where he was and how he was being treated. No one had told him any of this. He had known he was different from the Dursleys. He had not known what he was different into. The chamber was quiet. From the elders' section, Griselda Marchbanks spoke. She did not direct her question through Fudge. She asked it in the particular way that elderly people of genuine authority ask things, not loudly, not with any performance of weight, but with the directness of someone who has simply decided to know something. During your years at 4 Privet Drive, Ive, she said, did you ever feel safe? Harry looked at her. He took a moment, not because he did not know the answer, but because the question had 2 answers. From Voldemort, he said, from outside. I knew the Dursleys didn't want me there. I understood later that wanting me there wasn't required, only sheltering me. And they sheltered me. He paused. But I didn't know what safe was supposed to feel like on the inside. I didn't have anything to compare it to. Marchbanks looked at him for a long moment. She wrote something in the notes in front of her. She thanked him. He went back to the gallery. Dumbledore was questioned by Bones, then Fudge, then 2 of the elders in turn. He answered everything. He confirmed the mandate, his knowledge of Figg's reports, his decision to maintain the arrangement unchanged. He invoked the blood protection magic as his primary justification, Lily Potter's sacrifice, the requirement that Harry acknowledge Petunia's house as home. He spoke as a man giving formal testimony, exactly what he meant, nothing more. One of the Wisengamot elders, Harry did not know his name, an older man with a grey beard at the far end of the row, asked the question. Headmaster Dumbledore, the blood protection magic you have described, its requirements, as you understand them, are that Harry Potter must live with a blood relative of his mother's line who has chosen to shelter him, and that he must acknowledge that home as his own. That is correct, Dumbledore said. Did the blood protection magic require that Arabella Figg be instructed to say nothing about the surveillance arrangement? To speak to no one, to make no report to any authority other than yourself? Dumbledore looked at the elder. He looked at his own hands. Then he looked up. No, he said one word. No hesitation before it, no explanation after. He had said the same word to Harry privately in the kitchen at Grimmauld Place 6 weeks ago. Here it was again, public record, the recorder's quill, 50 members of the Wisengamot. The silence after it was brief. The chamber moved to deliberation. The vote took 12 minutes. Harry did not look at Dumbledore while they counted. The censure passed by a margin of 4 votes. Fudge read the formal language. Formal censure, conduct prejudicial to the welfare of a minor, suspension of Chief Warlock status pending review. The institution had turned and faced itself, and 4 votes beyond a bare majority was what the facing had produced. Not everything. Not nothing. Dumbledore received the reading without expression. He sat with his hands in his lap, his silver head level, his eyes at the middle distance. He did not look defeated. He looked like a man who had known this was coming and chosen to stand in front of it. Harry stood from the gallery bench and made his way to the stairs. He came out through the heavy door into the ministry corridor, and he stopped. And he stood with his back against the stone wall beside the door, and he waited. The corridor emptied slowly. Members of the Wisengamot in their robes, ministry officials, the man from the recorder's table with his rolled parchment. Harry watched them go. Then the door opened again, and Arabella Figg came out. She stopped when she saw him. She was in her grey coat. She looked like what she was, a woman who had done a hard thing twice in the same room and had not looked away either time. She looked at Harry against the wall, and he looked at her. They stood in the corridor, without saying anything, because there was nothing that needed to be said. Whatever this was, not forgiveness, not gratitude, nothing with a simple name, they had arrived at it together, from different directions. She nodded at him. He nodded back. Then they went their separate ways, and behind them the courtroom door stood closed, and the quiet of what had just been made permanent settled into the corridor. Formal censure proceedings of the Wisengamot required the DMLE to document, in full, the evidentiary chain that had given rise to the original hearing, which meant establishing the complete timeline of the events of the 2nd of August 1995. The Dementor attack in Little Whinging was the inciting incident. Harry Potter had performed underage magic in response to a Dementor attack, which had produced the hearing, which had produced Figg's testimony, which had produced the censure proceeding. To properly document the censure's origin, the DMLE needed to establish on the record how 2 Dementors had come to be in a Muggle suburb on the 2nd of August. This was, in Bones's experience, a routine cross-referencing exercise. Dementor movements from Azkaban required sanctioned authorization, logged with the appropriate office of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, countersigned by a senior official. She requested the dispatch logs for August 1995. She received them and reviewed them twice. There was no authorized dispatch order for the 2nd of August 1995, routine entries on either side of that date, documented normally. The 2nd of August had nothing. The Dementor Handler's movement records from Azkaban, however, documented the departure of 2 Dementors from the perimeter in the pre-dawn hours of the 2nd of August, and their return that afternoon. They had left without authorization. And someone had told them to go. She pulled the Azkaban communications logs for the 10 days preceding the 2nd of August and found what she was looking for on the 29th of July, a written directive to the senior Dementor Handler, logged as originating from the office of the Minister for Magic Dolores Jane Umbridge, Senior Undersecretary. The directive's contents were noted in the log as concerning security deployment arrangements, unspecified. There was no follow-up record. There was no counter-signature. There was no corresponding authorization in the dispatch logs because the authorization had never been obtained. Bones set the communications log down. She looked at it for a moment. Then she picked up a fresh sheet of parchment and wrote a meeting request to the Senior Undersecretary's office, marked urgent and marked private. Umbridge arrived at Bones's office 2 days later, on a Tuesday morning, in a pink cardigan and a smile that occupied most of her face. She looked, as she always looked, like someone whose pleasantness was the point rather than the expression of a feeling. She sat in the chair across from Bones's desk and folded her hands in her lap, and she tilted her head in the way she tilted it. Bones put the communications log on the desk between them, open to the entry of the 29th of July. She said, "I would like you to explain this communication, Madam Umbridge." Umbridge looked at it. Something happened in her face, not a confession, not alarm, but a very rapid assessment of what the document said and what she was going to say about it. The smile did not leave so much as it shifted, the kind of shift that happened when the thing the smile was covering became heavier than the smile could hold comfortably. She said she was not certain what communication Bones meant. Bones said she meant the directive of the 29th of July 1995 to the senior Dementor Handler at Azkaban, logged as originating from Umbridge's office, which appeared to have preceded the unsanctioned departure of 2 Dementors from the Azkaban perimeter on the 2nd of August 1995. Umbridge said there must be some confusion in the records. Bones said there was no confusion in the records. She said the records were a straightforward administrative log, and she would appreciate a straightforward explanation of the directive. Umbridge said she might have sent communications to Azkaban in the course of her regular duties, and that she could not be expected to recall every administrative matter. Bones asked whether Umbridge had authorized the deployment of 2 Dementors to Little Winging on the 2nd of August 1995. Umbridge said no, with the particular quality of that word when said by someone who knows the answer is not simple and has decided this is the word they will use, regardless. Bones thanked her and said she would be in touch. Umbridge left, the smile restored as she went through the door, and Bones sat with the documentation in front of her and thought about what could be done with a thing you had documented completely and could not prove to the standard courts required without a confession that was not coming. Then she went to see Cornelius Fudge. She laid the documents on his desk, and she walked him through them in the same methodical way she had walked through them herself. The dispatch logs, the movement records, the communications log, the directive. She did not editorialize. She did not need to. The documentation made its own argument. Fudge's face went through several states: blankness, then red, then a quality that was not quite grey, but had the weight of a man who has understood that the situation is worse than any of his immediate reactions. He said something about the records being potentially misinterpreted, Bones said they were not misinterpreted. He said there could be alternative explanations. Bones said she had examined the records carefully and had requested an explanation from Umbridge directly, and that the explanation given had not accounted for the directive. Fudge was quiet for a moment. Then he said that this was a sensitive matter and that he expected the DMLE to handle it with appropriate discretion. Bones said the record would be maintained. She said what was true, the record would be maintained, and any further steps would be subject to the legal framework. Fudge heard, in this whatever it was most useful for him to hear. He was not a stupid man. He understood that his senior undersecretary had dispatched dementors toward a 15-year-old without authorization, and that the record existed in DMLE files, and that Amelia Bones was not someone who lost or amended things in the service of political convenience. The matter did not become public. Fudge saw to that the specific exercise of ministerial discretion over what reached the press and what did not. Umbridge remained in her post. She also remained at Hogwarts, where she had been installed as defense against the dark arts professor and, as term progressed and the ministry's parallel instruments for controlling Hogwarts were deployed, as High Inquisitor. None of this was in Bones's power to prevent. What was in her power, she had done. She sent Dumbledore an official notification through ministry channels, informing him that the DMLE had completed its audit of the events of the 2nd of August 1995 and had documented findings relevant to the original Dementor attack. He could review the record at the DMLE offices at his convenience. He came on a Thursday morning. She did not stay in the room while he read it. She had established this as her practice with sensitive documentation. She provided the record. She was available for questions. She did not watch people's faces while they encountered the facts. He was in her office for 20 minutes. When she returned, he was sitting with the folder closed in front of him, and his hands resting on the cover, and his blue eyes directed at the surface of her desk. He said, after a moment, "Thank you, Madam Bones." She said it was part of the record. He rose and left. She did not know what he did with the information afterward. She thought about it once, briefly. Dumbledore had positioned Harry in Little Whinging. That positioning had created the geography. Umbridge had used the geography. His long arrangement had also told anyone paying attention precisely where the boy could be found, and which Surrey Street a Dementor might walk without attracting notice. He was not the person who had dispatched them. He was the person whose decisions had made the dispatch possible. That was not his fault, in the legal sense. She knew the difference between causation and culpability, but it was a weight to carry, and she thought he would carry it differently from the censure. The censure was formal and finished. This would not be finished. Some weeks after this, Percy Weasley walked a ministry corridor with a stack of files and an expression that was not quite his usual one. He had transcribed the hearing of the 12th of August. He had been in the room for the censure proceeding. He was 19 and loyal to the ministry in the way that people were loyal to institutions when they believed the institution and the right outcome were the same thing. He was learning in things he had written down himself, in his own careful handwriting, that this was not always true. He had not done anything with this learning yet. He might not for a long time, but it was there now, and once named, it did not become unnamed. He went back to his desk and picked up his quill. Sirius had been thinking. Harry noticed this in the way he noticed things about Sirius, not directly, because Sirius's thinking was not a visible process, but in the specific qualities of his silences. There was the Sirius who was restless and pacing, who couldn't stand the house and showed it. There was the Sirius who was furious about something and controlling it with the effort of a man who had learned in Azkaban that some feelings were too large for the rooms he lived in. And there was this one, the Sirius, who had gone very still and was working something out. He found out what on a Wednesday evening in late November, when Sirius came to his room and stood in the doorway and said he had asked Arthur to do something at the ministry and that Harry should know about it. The formal petition had been filed the week before. Arthur had submitted it under his own name as presenting party. Sirius could not appear at the ministry, could not sign his name to a ministry document without it becoming a warrant situation within the hour. So Arthur had gone in his place and had stood in a ministry anteroom and had filed a formal petition to the Wizengamot requesting a review of Harry Potter's guardianship arrangement. The petition cited the censure proceedings documentary record. No formal Wizengamot guardianship order had ever been issued in Harry Potter's case. The Dursleys had been chosen informally, by one man's private decision, without any instrument of magical law. The petitioner, acting on behalf of the named godfather, was asking that the matter be placed on the record. Harry sat on the edge of his bed and listened to this. He did not say anything while Sirius told him. He waited until the end. "Did Bones receive it?" he said. "She received it," Sirius said. "Arthur went back this afternoon." "I'll let him tell you what she said." Arthur was in the kitchen. He was sitting at the long table with a cup of tea and the patient expression he wore when he was waiting for a conversation he had already had to finish happening for the person he was about to have it with. When Harry came in and sat across from him, he set the cup down and looked at Harry steadily. "She tabled it," he said. He did not say it as bad news or as good news. He said it in the tone he used for information he had been given precisely and was going to pass on precisely without amendment. What does that mean, tabled? It means she didn't dismiss it. She said the petition cannot be processed through normal channels in its current form, because Sirius is still listed in ministry records as a convicted murderer who escaped Azkaban custody. That legal status has to be resolved before any petition made on his behalf can be formally considered. Arthur paused. She said, and she said this directly, so I'm telling you directly, that if Sirius Black is ever exonerated, the petition goes to the front of the queue. Her words, front of the queue. Harry looked at the table. He thought about what the front of the queue meant, practically. He thought about the ministry records that listed Sirius as a murderer. He thought about what exoneration would require, a formal hearing, testimony, the whole legal mechanism of the wizarding world, turned toward a case that had never had a proper hearing because Sirius had never been tried. She didn't say she believed he should be exonerated, Arthur added. She didn't say she believed the opposite, either. She tabled the petition rather than dismissing it. "I think that's worth something. It's worth something," Harry said. He meant it. He had lived his whole life in the gap between what was right and what the ministry would process, and he had learned enough in the last several months to know the difference between a door being locked and a door being closed. Bones had left it as a locked door, which was a different thing from the others. He asked the question he had been thinking since Sirius had told him about the petition. He asked it carefully because the answer mattered and he wanted to ask it right. If Sirius were exonerated tomorrow, he said, if all of it were sorted, the legal status, all of it, would living with him end the blood protection? Arthur looked at him. It was the look of a man who was deciding not to simplify, which was, Harry thought, one of the things he valued most about Arthur. He could have given Harry a simpler answer. He didn't. "The protection requires you to call Petunia's house home," Arthur said. "That's the heart of it. The magic is anchored to your acknowledgement of that place as home, not just to your physical presence there. If you moved to Sirius's, if there were a Sirius's to move to, and you still went back to Privet Drive each summer, if it could still be called home in some meaningful sense, the magic might hold. He paused. Might. It's complicated. I don't think anyone fully understands the parameters. What we know is that it's held for 15 years, and that Dumbledore believed returning you each summer was sufficient. What we don't know is whether living primarily elsewhere would break it or weaken it. Harry thought about this. He thought about the word home. He thought about lying on his back in his room at Privet Drive in August, counting 23 days on the ceiling, and about whether that constituted calling it home in any meaningful sense of the word. He thought about the blood protection magic. Lily's sacrifice, a choice made by someone else, an inheritance he had been born into and would carry until he came of age, regardless of what he wanted it to do. So we wait, he said. We wait, Arthur said. And we don't let them forget the petition is there. He said it without drama. He said it the way he said everything. In the mild, precise voice of a man who had been thinking about what was possible, and had settled on the things that were true rather than the things that were easier. The petition was on record. The record was in the files of the Wizengamot. Amelia Bones had taken it and tabled it rather than dismissed it, and Arthur had stood in a ministry anteroom in his muggle clothes and filed it under his own name because Sirius couldn't, and the whole apparatus of the thing was awkward and indirect and hamstrung by a legal situation that had been unjust for 14 years. It existed. That was what Arthur had done with the options available to him. Harry went back upstairs. Sirius was in the corridor outside his room, which was where Harry had known he would be, not pacing for once, just standing with his back against the wall and his arms crossed in the posture of a man who is waiting in the specific way of someone who has spent a long time. She tabled it, Harry said. Not dismissed, tabled. Sirius looked at him. If you're ever exonerated, Harry said, it goes to the front of the queue. Something moved in Sirius's face. Harry had learned to read it. Not the obvious things, not the fury or the brightness when he laughed, but the smaller things, the movements that happened in the space between the expressions. This one was complicated. It was not hope, exactly. It was not relief. It was the specific expression of a person who has been told that a thing they thought might simply not exist has been confirmed to exist, and is now doing the calculation of what that means in the context of everything else. He had been in Azkaban for 12 years. He had waited in a cell in the North Sea while the Ministry's record said he was guilty of something he had not done, and nobody had been keeping his case alive, and the petition that should have existed before Harry was 2 years old had not existed because no one had filed it. Now it existed. It was tabled, it was on record. Front of the queue, if the legal status were ever resolved, and the legal status was a separate problem, a large one, a problem that could not be solved tonight or in this corridor or by the two of them standing here. But tabled was not the same as Azkaban. Waiting with a documented petition in a ministry file was a different kind of waiting from waiting in a cell where the thing you were waiting for had not yet been named. He looked at Harry with the expression he sometimes had, the one that was Godfather rather than anything else, the one that knew what it meant to be 15 and to have been told, "We wait." "All right," he said, not cheerfully, not defeated, in the voice of a man who has found the shape of the situation and has decided he can stand in it. They went downstairs together, and Molly was making something in the kitchen, and Arthur was still at the table, and the house smelled of whatever was on the stove, and Harry sat down at the table with the people who had chosen to be here, and the petition was in a ministry file, and it would be there in the morning. Arabella Figg came home to her house in Little Whinging at the end of October, and the cats were waiting for her, and the curtains were the same curtains, and the photographs were still on the shelves where she had arranged them over 2 decades of careful, deliberate residence. She put the kettle on, and she stood in the kitchen while it heated, and she listened to the house, which sounded like a house rather than a post. She had been on the Wizengamots' formal record since August. Her name, her address, her account of 10 years of surveillance, all of it entered into the ministry's permanent archives. Whatever cover she had maintained for a decade was gone, replaced by the public knowledge of exactly what she had been doing in this house for all those years. The mission was over. The street was the same. She was the same woman who had lived in it. She drank her tea and looked at the house across the road and thought about what it was like to have done a thing and then come home to the place where you had not done it for so long. The cats settled around her by degrees, one on the table, one on the chair back, the small grey one on her feet. Harry came on the second Saturday of December at 10:30 in the morning on the night bus. She saw it from the window, the purple triple-decker lurching into the street with its characteristic lack of apology, stopping long enough to deposit a single passenger, and then lurching away again at the speed of something that considered traffic laws advisory. Harry stood on the pavement in front of her house, with his coat and his school bag, and the particular look of a 15-year-old who has made a decision and is standing in the place the decision has brought him. She watched him stand there before he knocked. She understood why he had been to this house 40 times, perhaps more, over the course of his childhood, and every time he had come because the Dursleys had sent him. He was working out what it felt like to come, because he wanted to. She opened the door before he raised his hand to knock. "Come in," she said. "I've just put the kettle on." This was not quite true. The kettle had gone off half an hour ago, but she put it on again, and Harry came through the door and stood in the sitting room with the photographs of cats on every surface, and she watched him look at them. He looked at them differently now. He knew what they had been. She made the tea and found the proper biscuits because that particular strategy was over. She set everything on the table, and he sat across from her, and she poured, and neither of them said anything for a moment. Then he asked the question, "Why did you say it, the rest of it, at the hearing? You could have stopped at the Dementors, described the alley, confirmed the attack, given Dumbledore his alibi witness. That's what he brought you there for. You could have stopped." She looked at him over her own cup. "I could have," she said. "But you didn't, no." She set her cup down. She had thought about how to answer this question many times, not because she didn't know the answer, but because the answer was longer than it looked, and she wanted to give him the true version rather than the short one. She said she had been watching him since he was 4 years old, under Dumbledore's instructions, because she believed they were right, and because she was an Order member, and because she had believed him 10 years of it. And then she had found herself standing in courtroom 10 with the formal weight of a Wizengamot proceeding at her back, 50 members in their seats with their ears properly open, the way a ministry proceeding forced open. A squib in the wizarding world did not often receive that kind of formal power. The oath meant everything she said was protected and documented. She was not going to use that moment only for a pair of Dementors. She had been not saying the rest of it for 10 years, and the room was finally the right room, and she said it. Harry was quiet for a moment. "Did you know," he asked, "what it was like in there?" He didn't gesture at the house across the street, but she knew he meant it. She thought about how to answer this with the same precision she had tried to bring to Bones's office. She said she had known it wasn't good. She had known it was not what you would report, not what any law would call abuse, not the sort of thing that had a name in any book. She said what she had seen was the spaces between the hand-me-down clothes. The portions at the table that were never quite enough, the way the Dursleys looked at him when he walked into a room, not with cruelty exactly, but with the particular quality of people regarding something they had agreed not to like. She said she had seen enough to worry, and not enough that the worry had anywhere to go. No official channel it could travel through without Dumbledore's instructions getting in the way, and that was the space his orders had lived in. That narrow gap between what could be proved and what was real. She said she was sorry she hadn't found a way around it sooner. He didn't say anything to that. He didn't say that was all right. Which she appreciated. It wasn't all right. They both knew that. But it was said now, in this kitchen, which was one more room where the truth had finally been let in. They sat with it for a moment. The grey cat had come to sit under the table. Outside, the street was doing its Saturday things. Someone's car, the distant sound of a door. Was it worth it? He said, telling the truth. She looked at her hands on the table. I don't know yet, she said. I'm an elderly squib with no active mission and rather a lot of cats. And Albus Dumbledore has been formally censured by the Wizengamot because I kept my oath in his own proceeding. And Harry Potter is sitting at my kitchen table drinking tea. He chose to come for. I'll take that. Whether that adds up to worth it, I expect I'll be deciding that for the rest of my life. He nodded slowly. He ate one of the biscuits and then looked at it, and she saw him understand that it was a proper biscuit, not a stale one, and something moved in his face, a small recognition. Too much, and not enough all at once. He left at noon. She watched him from the window, not from habit, not as surveillance, just as herself. He was 15, and he walked like someone who knew where he was going, which was different from the walk she had watched for 10 years. He went back to Hogwarts. She heard from the Order, in the way she still heard things without a formal role, that something was happening in the castle. A group of students gathering somewhere, teaching each other defense against the dark arts, away from Umbridge's sanctioned instruction. She heard Harry was teaching, and that he was good at it. This was not a surprise. He had spent his whole life holding knowledge he needed to protect himself without a proper place to put it. Now he was giving it to 30 people in a borrowed room. He had not been handed the role. He had taken it. That was the difference, and the more important one. Albus Dumbledore, somewhere in Hogwarts, was watching Harry teach. He was not organizing the group, or providing the curriculum, or managing the risks. He was observing a 15-year-old boy who had decided that what he knew was no longer only his to carry, and he was not interfering. She thought this was probably, for Dumbledore, harder than most people would understand. In December, the afternoons went early in Little Whinging. By 3 o'clock, the street had the particular quality of winter English light, flat and pale and honest about the fact that the day was ending. She made another cup of tea, and she sat in her chair by the window. Tibbles was asleep on the sill in the last of the thin sunlight, one paw hanging over the edge. The house across the road was a house with a family in it. The family was not kind. They were not going to become kind. But Harry Potter was at school, choosing who he was going to be, and the Wizengamot's record contained his name and his account of what it had been like to live in that house, and no one could reach into the ministry's archive and remove it. The truth was out, not fixed, out, which was a different thing. Harder to do in some ways, easier to live with in others. The watching was over, the silence. What remained was the ordinary life of an elderly woman on an ordinary street, sitting with her tea and her cats in the declining winter light, having said the true thing in the room with the power to hear it. She had been not saying it for 10 years, she had said it. That was the shape of what she had done, and she was still deciding what it weighed, and she would probably be deciding for the rest of her life, and she was all right with that. She drank her tea. Mr. Tibbles twitched in his sleep. The street outside was quiet,